He backhanded her so hard she hit the wall before she even knew she was falling. That was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Evelyn Mercer had already written the letter. She had nothing left. No money, no family who would take her in, no neighbor brave enough to speak against Silas Mercer's name. What she had was a torn scrap of newspaper, a stub of pencil barely worth holding, and one address, a post office box in a mountain town she had never heard of. The advertisement was 3 lines long. Mountain man seeks a wife. Hard life, honest work, no cruelty. 3 lines. She read them so many times the ink smeared under her thumb. She spent her last coin on a stamp. If you've ever stood at the edge of a decision that could either save your life or end it, and you had no way of knowing which, then you already understand exactly where Evelyn Mercer was standing. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, something real and hard-won, please take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next on that mountain will stay with you for a long time. The night it all broke open for good had started the same way most bad nights started in the Mercer house, with the sound of Silas coming through the door. Evelyn had learned over years that stacked themselves like stones on her chest to read the sound of that door. The way the hinges groaned told her something. The weight of his boots on the floorboards told her more. On quiet nights, when the day had gone his way, when a deal had closed or a man had folded under his pressure, the door opened slow. He'd come in trailing something almost like peace, and she could breathe, at least until morning. But on nights like this one, the door didn't open so much as it was thrown. She was at the kitchen table when it happened. She had a bowl of soup she hadn't started eating yet because she'd heard the wagon before she heard the door, and some deep animal part of her had already told her to wait, to not move, to take up as little space as possible and hope he moved through the room like weather, loud, punishing, but ultimately passing. He didn't pass. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her the way a man looks at something he owns and finds disappointing. His coat was still on. Mud on his boots, tracking across the floor she'd cleaned that morning on her knees. "There's a reason this house smells like burned wood," he said. She had burned the edge of a pie crust 3 hours ago. She had opened every window. She had lit a tallow candle near the stove to cover it. She thought she'd managed it. Apparently not. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it the way she said most things to Silas, quietly, without looking directly at him, the same way you don't look directly at something that might charge. "You're sorry." He said the words back to her like they tasted bad in his mouth. 27 years old and you still can't manage a stove without ruining the whole house. She didn't answer. She had learned that answering usually made things worse, and that silence sometimes made things worse too, and that there was rarely a right response to Silas Mercer when he had already decided to be angry. The decision happened in him before he walked through the door. The cause was just whatever he found when he got there. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and she was already tensing, already pulling her shoulders in, and then his hand came across the side of her face with the flat, casual force of a man swatting something off a shelf. She hit the wall. She didn't feel the impact of it right away. There was a half second of pure white nothing, and then she was sitting on the floor with her back against the plaster and a sound like rushing water behind her ears. The soup bowl had tipped when she fell. She could feel the warmth of the broth spreading across the floor, soaking into the knee of her dress. Silas looked down at her, not with rage. That was the thing that frightened her most about him. He wasn't raging. He looked almost bored. "Clean that up," he said, and walked out of the kitchen. She sat on the floor for a while, not because she couldn't move, but because moving felt like something that would require more of her than she currently had. The rushing sound faded. The left side of her face started to ache with its own specific, familiar pulse. She'd had that pulse before, enough times to know it would settle into a bruise by morning, purple-yellow at the edges, the kind she'd learned to cover with her hair or the collar of her dress. The soup had pooled around her left hand. She watched it for a moment, just watched it, and something happened inside her that she didn't have a name for right away. It wasn't anger exactly. She'd felt anger before and buried it so fast and so deep that she'd nearly forgotten what it felt like. This was something quieter than anger and somehow more dangerous. It was a thought, clear and cold, sitting right in the middle of her chest like a stone dropped into still water. I'm going to die in this house. Not a dramatic thought, not a cry for help, just a fact stated plainly, the way you might look out a window and note that it is raining. She was 27 years old, and her brother had been hitting her for 15 of those years since she was 12, and their parents were barely cold in the ground, since the moment he understood that there was no one left to stop him. She had stayed because she had nowhere to go. She had stayed because women in her position, in a town where Silas Mercer had connections and a reputation for being difficult, didn't have a great many options. She had stayed because leaving felt impossible. But sitting on the kitchen floor in a puddle of cold soup with her face aching, she understood something she hadn't quite faced before. Staying was also going to kill her, just slower. She got up. She cleaned the floor. She did not speak to Silas for the rest of the evening, and he did not speak to her, and the house settled into its terrible quiet. But something had shifted. She could feel it. Some internal latch she hadn't known was still engaged had finally, quietly, come undone. She found the newspaper advertisement 2 days later. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been lining the bottom of a drawer with old newspaper, the way you did when the paper was too worn to read and too useful to throw away. And the small block of text caught her eye almost by accident. Seeking a wife, mountain life in the Blackstone Range, hard work required, honest man, no cruelty promised and none given. Respond to G. Hale, P.O., Box 14, Caldwell Station. She read it twice. Then she folded that section of the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket before she even made a conscious decision to do so. That night she read it again by lamplight, in her room, with the door closed and the chair tilted against the handle the way she'd learned to sleep. Not because the lock worked, but because the scraping sound bought her a second of warning. G. Hale. She didn't know anything about him. A mountain man which told her the life would be rough. The Blackstone Range, she'd heard the name. Days north and east of here, up into country where the winters were legendary and the settlements were sparse. Hard country. The kind of country that killed people who weren't paying attention. She sat with all of that and asked herself a question that surprised her with how easily it came. Is that worse than here? She could not honestly say that it was. She found a stub of pencil. She tore the back panel from an old flour sack because it was the smoothest surface she had. She sat at her small desk, the one that had been her mother's, and she wrote a letter. Not a long one. She wasn't a foolish woman, and she knew better than to pour her whole broken history out to a stranger. She wrote her name. She wrote her age. She wrote that she was experienced in domestic work, that she was not afraid of hard labor, that she could learn what she didn't know. She wrote that she was looking for a fresh start in an honest situation. She almost didn't write the last line. She stared at the blank space at the bottom of the flour sack paper for a long time before her hand moved. I don't need much. I just need it to be different from what I have. She folded it. She addressed it. She had one coin. A single coin. The last of the small money she kept hidden in a seam of her mother's dress in the bottom of her trunk. Money she'd been hiding in 2-cent and 3-cent increments for 3 years without any clear plan, just the bone-deep instinct that someday she might need it. One coin was exactly enough for a stamp. She mailed it the next morning while Silas was out, walking to the postal office with her hat pulled low on the side where the bruise was still vivid, handing the letter to the postal clerk with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel. Then she went home and waited. The reply took 11 days. She nearly lost her nerve 4 separate times in those 11 days. Twice she talked herself out of it entirely, convinced herself it was foolishness, that a stranger posting an advertisement in a newspaper for a wife was either desperate in ways that spelled danger or dishonest in ways that spelled something worse. She reminded herself that she knew nothing about this man. She reminded herself that trading one bad situation for another wasn't survival. It was just geography. Then Silas knocked her into the doorframe over a misplaced tool she hadn't known was missing, and on the 11th day, the letter arrived. It was short. The handwriting was careful, not elegant, not the hand of an educated man with time for flourishes, but deliberate, each letter pressed firmly into the page as if the man writing it understood that words mattered enough to be made legible. Miss Mercer, I received your letter. I am not a man of many words, so I will say plainly that I found your letter honest, and I value honesty above most things. The life up here is not easy. Winters are long, and the work does not stop. I would not want to mislead you about what you'd be coming to, but what I offered in that advertisement is what I meant. No cruelty. I've seen enough of that in my life to know I don't want it in my home. If you're willing to make the journey to Caldwell Station, I will meet you at the stage stop. We can speak properly and decide together. I won't hold you to anything until we've met face to face and you've had the chance to see what you'd be walking into. If you come, I'll be there. G. Hale. She read it 3 times. She noticed the line she kept returning to. I've seen enough of that in my life to know I don't want it in my home. That line told her something about him, though she couldn't have said exactly what. It told her he wasn't writing from the outside of cruelty. He'd been near it. He knew its shape. She folded the letter and put it in the seam of her mother's dress alongside the space where the coin used to be. That night she started packing. Quietly. Slowly. Only the things she could fit in a single bag without the bag looking full, because if Silas saw a bag that looked full, he'd want to know why. She left on a Thursday before the sky was fully light. She hadn't slept. She'd lain in her room through the long dark hours, listening to the house breathe around her, and at some point in the deep middle of the night, she'd started shaking and couldn't stop. Not from cold. Her hands just wouldn't be still. She pressed them flat against her mattress and breathed and told herself to be steady, that shaking was fine, that she could shake and still move, that one did not cancel out the other. At 4 a.m, she heard Silas's breathing change in the room down the hall. That thick, heavy rhythm that meant he was deep under. She waited another 20 minutes. Then she got up, dressed without lighting the lamp, picked up her bag, and walked out of her room. The hallway was dark. She knew every board in it, knew which ones would protest under weight and which ones could be trusted. She'd been memorizing that hallway for 3 years, she realized now. She'd been learning to walk through it without making a sound even before she had any conscious plan to use that knowledge. She made it to the front door. She eased it open, wincing at the slight pull of the hinges, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold and smelled like wood smoke from somewhere down the road, and something else. Earth, darkness, the particular smell of very early morning before anything had warmed up enough to have a scent. She stood on the porch for just a moment. She thought about going back. She thought about it seriously, stood there and genuinely considered it, weighed it, turned it over. The thought wasn't small. She was walking out with a bag and no money and an address in a place she'd never been, to meet a man she'd never seen, on the strength of 2 letters and a newspaper advertisement. She also thought about the kitchen floor and the cold soup and the sound of her own silence becoming something she would not survive. She stepped off the porch. She didn't look back. Not from bravery. She didn't feel particularly brave. She didn't look back because she knew herself well enough to know that if she did, she might stop, and stopping was not something she could afford. The stage north left from the edge of town at 5:30. She had just enough time to walk there. The bruise on her face had faded to a dull yellow at the edges. Her bag was light. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. She bought her ticket with the small amount she'd scraped together from the lining of her coat, a coat Silas had never bothered to search because he'd never thought she was smart enough to hide anything. The stage driver didn't ask her anything. He just took her ticket and told her to find a seat. She climbed up and sat by the window and watched the town she had lived in her entire life grow smaller, and then disappear around a bend in the road. She felt something she couldn't immediately name. Sitting with it for a while, she understood. It wasn't relief. It was too raw and too unsteady to be relief. It was more like the feeling after you finally pulled out a splinter you've been carrying so long you started to think it was just part of you. The hurt didn't stop right away, but something sharp was gone. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cold glass of the stage window and watched the unfamiliar countryside begin to unspool in front of her, and she thought, I don't know what I'm going toward, but I know what I'm going away from. That would have to be enough. For now, that would have to be enough. The road north unfolded ahead of her, pale in the early light, leading up toward the dark shapes of mountains she could just begin to see gathering at the edge of the horizon. The Blackstone Range. Cold, she'd heard. Unforgiving. The kind of country that didn't make room for weakness. She had been told that about herself too, her whole life. She was beginning to suspect that both she and the mountain had been described by people who didn't know them very well. The stage road north got worse the closer it got to the mountains. Evelyn had expected that, in a general sort of way. She wasn't naive enough to think the road into remote country would be the same as the road between towns, but the reality of it was something different from expectation. What started as a well-packed dirt track softened by the previous week's rain gradually became something the driver had to navigate rather than simply follow, weaving around washed-out ruts and patches where the road had simply given up being a road and returned to being ground. The stage rocked. The other passengers, a heavy-set merchant who fell asleep almost immediately, and a younger woman traveling with two small children who needed constant managing, shifted and grabbed and muttered. Evelyn braced herself with one hand against the window frame and watched the landscape change. She had never been this far north. The country opened up and then gradually began to close in again as the foothills rose on either side. The trees changed. They got taller and darker, the gaps between them narrower, and the light that came through them had a different quality. Thinner, somehow, more careful. She could see the peaks now. They weren't the gentle swells she'd known all her life, the soft hills of the valley country where she'd grown up. These were something else. Serious shapes. The kind of country that didn't invite you so much as permit you, and only conditionally at that. She sat with her bag on her lap and tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. Thinking too hard was dangerous right now. If she thought too hard, she would start listing every reasonable objection to her current situation, and the list was long enough to be genuinely alarming. She focused instead on the window, on the trees, on the pale road unreeling ahead of them. She reached Caldwell Station in the late afternoon of the second day. It wasn't much of a town. A main street with enough buildings to count on both hands, a general store, a post office barely bigger than a root cellar, a feed barn, a small tavern that doubled as the stage stop. She climbed down stiffly from the stage, her back aching from 2 days on hard wood, her legs uncertain under her, and stood on the packed dirt of the main street while the driver handed her bag down. She looked around. The street was not crowded. A few men near the feed barn, a woman crossing toward the general store, a dog asleep in the weak afternoon sunlight outside the tavern, and one man standing apart from the rest near the corner of the stage stop building, watching her with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting and was not entirely sure what he'd been waiting for. She knew it was him before any rational reason presented itself. She knew it the way you know a storm before it arrives, by a shift in the air and a stillness that has intention in it. He was tall. That was the first thing. Taller than she'd expected, which wasn't logical since she hadn't been expecting any particular height. He had the kind of build that comes from years of actual physical labor, rather than any effort toward it, shoulders that carried themselves without performance. His face was weathered, not old, but worked on by sun and cold and time outdoors. And he had dark eyes that were hard to read from a distance, except that they were steady. He held his hat in his hands. He didn't move toward her right away. He waited. She realized after a moment that he was waiting for her to be ready. She picked up her bag and walked toward him. They stopped a few feet apart. He looked at her face, not at the faded remnant of bruising she'd tried to cover with the collar of her coat, or not obviously. And he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Mercer." "Mr. Hale." A pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, more like both of them taking the other's measure in a way that deserved a moment of actual silence rather than nervous filling. "You had a long ride," he said. 2 days. "Are you hungry?" It was such a plain, practical question that she almost laughed. Not from amusement, from some release of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. She was, in fact, very hungry. She'd eaten sparingly on the road because she'd had very little money to spare for food at the stage stops, and the merchant had snored so loudly the second night that she'd slept only in snatches. "Yes," she said. "I am." He nodded, like that settled something. "There's a woman here who does a decent supper. We should talk before anything else is decided. If you want to walk away after we've talked, I'll make sure you have safe passage back south." She looked at him. "You mean that?" "I said it." She considered him for another moment. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." They sat at a corner table in the tavern, away from the handful of other men drinking near the bar, and a woman with the bearing of someone who'd been doing hard work her whole life without complaint brought them plates of beans and salt pork and bread that was 2 days old but still good. Evelyn ate with more appetite than she'd expected. Gideon Hale ate steadily and without self-consciousness, and she noticed that he didn't watch her eat the way some men watched women eat, with judgment or with something worse than judgment. He was simply eating his own food and letting her eat hers. They talked. He told her what the life was. He didn't soften it, which she appreciated because softening it would have told her something important and unflattering about his honesty. The cabin was a day's ride up into the mountains. He'd built it himself 8 years ago, added to it twice since. He ran trap lines in the winter and kept a modest kitchen garden in the short summer and traded furs in Caldwell Station twice a year. He had a mule and 2 horses and a dog named Ruckus, who, he said without expression, was not well named because the dog was the least excitable animal he'd ever owned. But it had seemed like a good idea at the time. She almost smiled at that. He told her the winters were long. He said it the way people say things they've stopped expecting to be believed, plainly, without emphasis, leaving it up to her whether she took it seriously. He said that there were weeks at a stretch when the weather made it impossible to go anywhere, when the world shrank to the size of 4 walls and the spaces immediately around them. He said a woman would need to be comfortable with that, not just capable of enduring it, actually capable of being comfortable in a silence that lasted. "Are you?" he asked. She thought about the Mercer house, about the quality of the silence there, which was never really silence but the held breath before something happened. She thought about what a silence might feel like that was simply silence, no threat in it, no waiting, no bracing for the sound of boots on floorboards. "I think I might be," she said. "I've never had a chance to find out." He absorbed that without pressing her on it. That was something she noticed about him. He didn't press. He said what he had to say and left space for her to say what she had to say, and didn't try to fill the gaps with the kind of talk that was really just a different form of control. She told him about herself. Not everything. She wasn't ready for everything, and she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready to lay Silas out plainly for a stranger's examination. But she told him she'd been managing a household alone for a long time, that she was capable of hard work, that she wasn't frightened of physical difficulty. She told him she was looking for a situation that was honest. She used that word deliberately, watching his face. He met her eyes when she said it. "That's what I offered," he said. "I know what you offered," she said. "I'm telling you what I need. There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more internal than that. Like she'd said something that confirmed a thought he'd been holding quietly. "Fair enough," he said. They finished eating. The woman cleared the plates. Outside, the light had gone the thin amber of late afternoon moving toward evening. "I have 2 rooms at the boarding house down the road," Gideon said. "One for you tonight. We can decide tomorrow morning." She looked at him across the table. "I've already decided," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You sure?" She had been sure since she'd read the line about cruelty in his letter. She'd been sure since she'd stepped off the porch before sunrise with her bag and her shaking hands and not looked back. She'd been working her way toward this decision for 15 years, and she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't. "Mr. Hale," she said carefully, "I didn't come this far to turn around in the morning." He looked at her for a long moment, and she couldn't read his expression clearly, but it didn't frighten her. That itself was remarkable. That she could sit across from a large, serious, unfamiliar man and not feel the specific tension in her chest that she'd spent 15 years associating with men who took up more space than she felt she had. "All right," he said. "There's a minister in town. We can do it proper tomorrow if that's what you want." "That's what I want," she said. "Well," they married the next morning in the minister's front room, which smelled like dried herbs and old books, with the minister's wife and the woman from the tavern as witnesses. It took about 12 minutes. There were no flowers. Evelyn wore her better dress, the gray wool one, which was not particularly bridal, but it was clean and it was hers. Gideon wore a collar she suspected he'd borrowed or purchased that morning based on how carefully he was not touching it. He said his words steadily, without rushing, making eye contact. She said hers the same way. When it was done and the papers were signed, the minister's wife pressed Evelyn's hand and said she hoped she'd be happy up on that mountain. And the way she said it, warm but cautious, the way people say things when they genuinely aren't certain of the answer, made Evelyn understand that Gideon Hale was known in this town, and known as someone who kept largely to himself, and that the general opinion was not unfavorable, but also not certain. They loaded her bag onto the horse he'd brought for her, a sturdy brown mare, not pretty but sensible looking, and started north out of town before the morning was half done. She had married a man she'd spoken to for the first time yesterday afternoon. The thought was large enough that she kept bumping up against it and then moving past it because there was nothing productive to do with it now except go forward. The ride up into the mountains took the better part of a day. The cabin sat in a clearing backed by a wall of pines so dense they blocked the wind from the north, which she would come to understand was not an accident. Gideon had chosen the site for that reason, among others. It was larger than she'd expected. Not grand, not comfortable in any way that involved softness or decoration, but solid. The logs were tight and even. The roof was sound. The door fit its frame without gaps. A woodpile that would have taken her months to accumulate stood stacked along the south wall, taller than she was, seasoned and ready. She stood in the doorway and looked around at the interior. A cast-iron stove, a table, 2 chairs, a workbench along one wall with tools hung above it in a specific order, a shelf with provisions, a second room through a doorway, a bedroom. She didn't go in yet. Gideon had come in behind her and set her bag down near the door. He stood with his hands at his sides, and she understood that he was waiting again, waiting for her to look, to assess, to decide what she thought. "It's clean," she said. It was. Not the performed cleanliness of a man trying to impress, but the practical cleanliness of someone who lived alone and had settled into habits of order that worked for him. "I'm not untidy," he said. Mostly. I leave boots places they shouldn't be." She turned and looked at him. He wasn't joking exactly. His face didn't do easy jokes. But there was something in the delivery that she thought was his version of lightness. "I'll manage that," she said. She put her bag down in the bedroom without making a production of it. She came back out and looked at the stove. She asked where he kept the coffee, and he told her. And she made coffee because her hands needed something to do, and the smell of it in an unfamiliar space would help settle something in her that was still working on calming down. They sat at the table with the coffee and didn't talk much. The quiet was different from the quiet she'd grown up with. She noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure, not dramatically, but definitively. It settled around her instead of pressing in on her. That night she lay in the bedroom on the side of the bed closest to the wall and listened to the sounds of the mountain, sounds she had no catalog for yet, all the creaks and shifts and distant animal calls that she would need weeks to learn. And she didn't sleep for a long time. But she wasn't afraid. That was new. The first week was an education in how much she didn't know. She had thought herself capable, and she was, in the ways she'd had opportunity to develop. She could cook on a decent stove. She could preserve and mend and manage a household budget. She knew how to work. What she didn't know was any of the specific knowledge required by this specific life, and the gap between general competence and the skills demanded by the mountain became apparent almost immediately. The second morning, she went to add wood to the stove and misjudged the draft, and filled the cabin with smoke. She got the door open, and the smoke thinned, but her eyes were streaming, and her pride was stinging more than her lungs. Gideon came in from outside, took one look at the situation, adjusted the damper on the stovepipe with 2 practiced turns, and didn't say a word about it. She waited for him to say something. He didn't. "I should have asked you how it worked before I touched it," she said. "I should have shown you," he said. "My fault." She looked at him. In her experience, when things went wrong, fault was something that got assigned to whoever had the least power to push back. The idea that he would simply take the blame for her mistake, not as a performance, not with any weight behind it, just as a plain statement of fact, was disorienting. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "It was both of ours then," he said. "Come here, I'll show you how the damper works." He showed her. Not in a way that implied she was slow, not with the particular patience of someone managing their irritation, just straightforward instruction. Here is the thing. Here is how it works. Here is why. She paid attention. She asked 2 questions. He answered both of them the same way directly. This became the pattern. He showed her how to manage the stove through different weather conditions, because the draft changed with temperature and wind. He showed her how to read the woodpile, which wood burned long and which burned hot, and which combination you wanted at what time of day. He showed her how to store the perishables to keep them through temperature swings, and how to check the root cellar for moisture problems before they became rot problems. He showed her the rifle. That one surprised her. She'd grown up in a house where the guns belonged to men, and the understanding was clear and unspoken. She had never touched a firearm, never expected to. The morning he lifted the rifle down from its hooks above the door and held it out toward her, she didn't reach for it right away. "I don't know how to use that," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm showing you. You want me to learn to shoot. I want you to be able to handle yourself if I'm not here," he said. "There are things on this mountain that will test you, bear mostly, and the occasional cat. Men, sometimes, when they think nobody's watching. You need to be able to make the question clear." She took the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, and she adjusted her grip instinctively, redistributing the weight. He watched her do it. "Good," he said quietly, and she wasn't sure if he was talking about the grip or something else. He was not a natural teacher in the sense of possessing easy words for things he'd long since moved past needing to think about. He had to slow down and locate the steps of his own knowledge, pull it back to its component parts, name things he did automatically. She could sometimes see him working at it, a pause, a search for the right starting point, but he did it, every time, without frustration, without making her feel like the asking was an imposition. She practiced with the rifle 3 times a week in the clearing. She was not a natural shot. She was, in fact, fairly terrible for the first 2 weeks. She pulled to the right, and she flinched, and the flinching made her pull, and the pulling made her flinch. And she stood in the clearing frustrated with herself while the targets he'd set up on the far tree line sat there smugly undamaged. "You're anticipating the kick," he said one afternoon, watching her from a few feet back. "I know I am," she said, with more edge than she intended. "Most people do it first. That's not making me do it less." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Close your eyes." She looked at him. "Close them," he said. "Just for a second. Picture the target. Picture the bullet going where you're pointing. Don't think about what's going to happen after you squeeze the trigger. Just the target." She thought it was foolish. She closed her eyes anyway and did what he said. And when she opened them and raised the rifle and fired, the shot went 3 inches closer to center than any shot she'd managed before. It wasn't the vision. She knew that. It was the half-second of genuine calm it had given her, breaking the feedback loop between anticipation and reaction. He had known that. He'd just found the sideways approach to telling her. She didn't say anything. She reloaded and tried again. "Better," he said. Just that. October came in hard. The first real cold arrived not gradually, but all at once, the way it apparently did at this elevation. One morning she woke up, and the temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight, and the world outside was a different world than the one she'd gone to sleep in. She stood in the doorway looking at the frost on the grass of the clearing, the white-tipped pines, the sky the color of pewter beaten flat, and she felt something move in her chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite wonder. Gideon appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him cross the room. He moved quietly for a large man, and stood looking at the same view. "First freeze," he said. "It happened fast. Always does up here. Summer argues as long as it can, and then quits all at once." He paused. "The storms will start coming soon. When they do, we stay in, not a choice." She had heard him say this, about the storms, about the weeks of confinement, back in Caldwell Station, over beans and salt pork. She'd understood it as information. Standing here looking at that sky, she understood it as a fact she was going to have to live inside, which was different. "How long?" she asked. "Last year, the worst of it ran 4 weeks straight," he said. "Some years less. Some more. 4 weeks inside 4 walls with a man she'd known for a month. 4 weeks with nowhere to go, no one else to speak to, no escape from whatever they turned out to be to each other when there was nothing left to distract from it. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the sky with the expression of a man reading something familiar, assessing, planning, not dreading. "You don't mind it," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "The quiet doesn't bother me," he said simply. "Never has." "That's either a very good sign or a very concerning one," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. That was Gideon Hale's version of a laugh. A small, involuntary acknowledgement that something had landed, contained immediately, like he wasn't quite sure what to do with the impulse. She went back inside to start the stove and found that she was, improbably, looking forward to finding out. The first storm came 8 days later. It arrived the way he'd described things arriving on the mountain, without extended warning, with the bluntness of something that owed no explanations. She watched from the window as the sky went from gray to white to a blinding horizontal rush of snow that turned the clearing into a wall of white so dense she couldn't see the first line of trees. Gideon was already inside. He'd known it was coming the afternoon before by something in the clouds she didn't have the vocabulary for yet, and they'd spent the daylight hours bringing in extra wood, double-checking the food stores, making sure the horses and the mule were secured and comfortable in the shelter he'd built behind the cabin. By the time the storm hit, everything that needed doing was done. He sat down in the chair near the stove with a piece of leather harness he was mending and started working on it without fanfare. She sat down with the mending of her own she'd been putting off, and listened to the storm outside and felt the cabin hold against it. The walls were solid. She could feel the wind pushing at them, hear it finding the gaps around the chimney and making its particular pitch of complaint. But the cabin didn't shudder. It stood. She found herself placing her hand briefly against the log wall next to her chair, pressing her palm flat against the wood. It was warm. Not from heat exactly, from solidity, from mass. This had been built to stand against exactly this. She sewed. He mended leather. The storm roared outside, and the fire in the stove made its small, sensible sounds, and the hours moved at the pace of hours when there is nowhere to be and nothing urgent, and the whole world has narrowed to the reliable and the present. She thought without deciding to. I have never in my life sat in a room and not been afraid of who was also in it. The thought was so plain and so large at the same time that she sat with it quietly for a while, holding it, turning it over. Not with sadness, exactly. With something more like the specific tenderness you feel when you understand for the first time the size of something you've been missing for a long time without knowing its name. Gideon looked up from his work after a while. He didn't say anything immediately. He was looking at the stove, not at her, but she had the sense he was aware of her the way people are aware of things they're paying attention to without staring. "You doing all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and because something about the storm outside and the solidity of the walls had made her feel like honesty was the appropriate material for the moment. "Actually, I am." He nodded, went back to the leather. She went back to her mending. Outside, the wind made its long, wild sound against the logs, and the cabin held and held and held. They learned each other in the stop time of that winter the way you learn most things that matter. Not all at once, not by design, but through the accumulation of small moments that each seemed minor, until you looked back at them from a distance and saw the shape they'd made together. She learned that he had grown up in rough country with a father who considered silence the appropriate response to most situations, which explained the economy of his speech without excusing the occasions when he needed to say something and didn't quite manage to get there. She learned this not because he told her so, he didn't, not directly, but because of the way he handled difficulty. When something went wrong, when the cold caused a problem with the roof drain or the horses needed more feed than he'd calculated, he absorbed it physically, went quiet, and worked at it until it was resolved. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for someone else to carry the frustration. She told him, one evening in the deep of January, why she'd left. Not everything. She still wasn't ready for everything. But enough. She told him about Silas, about the years of it, about the kitchen floor and the cold soup and the clear thought that had arrived on the heels of it. She told it plainly, the way she'd learned was the only way to say true things that were hard, because if you dressed them up, they became more about the dressing and less about the truth. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't perform concern. didn't react with the theatrical horror that would have made her feel like what she'd shared was now a spectacle rather than a confidence. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You ever come looking for people who left?" he asked. The question landed on her like something cold. She had thought about this. She had, in fact, thought about it regularly since she'd arrived. A low-grade awareness sitting at the back of her mind that Silas Mercer was not the kind of man who let things go. "He has before," she said carefully. Gideon looked at her. His expression was its usual considered stillness, but underneath it she was beginning, after 3 months, to read him well enough to see what it covered. Not alarm, not performance, just a man filing information and deciding what it meant. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. "That's all? What would you like me to say?" She thought about it. She wasn't sure. She'd expected something, some version of a promise or an assurance, or alternatively some version of complication, of him reconsidering what he'd taken on. What she got instead was simply, "All right," an acknowledgement, a quiet absorption of a fact and a repositioning around it without drama. "I don't know," she said honestly. "He'd have a long way to come," Gideon said, "and he'd have to know where to look." He paused. "But if he did find his way up here, we'd handle it." "We." It was a small word. She noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't make a sound but changes the quality of the air in a room. She didn't say anything more about it. She let the conversation move on to other things, to whether the drift behind the woodpile needed clearing, to the state of the root cellar, to the practical and present concerns of the life they were inside together. But that word stayed with her. We. The winter stretched on. She learned to move through it. She learned to read the storms before they peaked, to bank the fire in the precise way that held through the night without wasting wood, to keep the pathways between the cabin and the horse shelter clear of ice by a method that required attention and prevented injury. She learned the rifle until she could put 3 shots in a grouping tight enough that Gideon, watching, said, "You won't need to worry about the bear," with a tone of plain satisfaction that she valued more than any compliment she'd ever been paid. She learned the mountain, and somewhere in the learning, without a date she could point to, without a moment she could identify as the turning point, she stopped feeling like someone who had fled into this life and started feeling like someone who lived in it. That was the difference. It was not dramatic. It was not a revelation that came with any ceremony. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February when she walked back to the cabin from the horse shelter in the cold, her breath coming in small clouds, her boots solid on the packed snow, and she looked at the cabin with its smoke coming from the chimney. And she thought, "That's my home." Simple as that. Terrifying as that. The past had not forgotten her. She knew that. The thing Gideon had said, "We'd handle it," lived in her the way things live in you when you understand they're going to be tested eventually. Silas would come. She didn't know when, she didn't know how, but she knew her brother, and she knew that somewhere back down in that valley town, he had noticed her absence and had not taken it as a loss so much as a defiance, and Silas Mercer did not absorb defiance. He went after it. The mountain held its winter silence around her. She walked back to her own door, stomped the snow from her boots, and went inside to the warmth that was waiting. Whatever was coming would come. And when it did, she would be here. Not the woman who had shaken through the dark of a Thursday morning with her bag and her 1 coin and her not looking back. Something harder than that. Something the mountain had been quietly making of her, the way cold and time and use make certain things stronger than they were when they started. She was not done being afraid. She was not done having days that caught her off guard with a sudden cold wave of memory. Silas's hand, the wall, the floor, the soup spreading warm and then cold. She was not going to pretend those things had been erased by 3 months on a mountain, because pretending was something she'd left behind with everything else in that house. But she was still here, still standing, still learning the particular language of this life, and the particular language of this man who had offered her honesty and kept the offer without being asked to prove it repeatedly. That would have to mean something. She was willing to bet it did. Outside, the wind found the chimney again, and the fire answered it with a low, steady sound that asked nothing and gave warmth anyway. She put the kettle on and waited for Gideon to come back from checking the trap lines, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the cabin floor. and the mountain winter held everything it held, and she held her place inside it. The snow began to melt in early March, but slowly, the way things thawed at that elevation, reluctantly, a little at a time, as if the mountain wasn't fully convinced winter was done and wanted to keep its options open. Evelyn noticed the change first in the light. The afternoon started holding on to their brightness a few minutes longer each day, the kind of difference you wouldn't measure but could feel in your body, some animal part of her responding to it before the thinking part had registered what was happening. The snow on the south face of the clearing pulled back from the cabin wall by a foot, then two, and the ground beneath it emerged dark and wet and smelling of things that had been waiting under ice for months. She was outside splitting kindling one morning when Gideon came back from checking the lower trapline earlier than she'd expected. He unsaddled the horse and turned it into the shelter and came to stand near her without speaking for a moment. And she could read by now, after 5 months of learning the particular language of his silences, that something was on his mind. She kept splitting, let him find his way to it. "Ran into Harlan Briggs on the South Trail," he said finally. Harlan was a trapper who worked the country 2 ridges east, a spare, weathered man in his 60s who came through 3 or 4 times a year and shared information the way people in that country shared everything useful, plainly, without ceremony. "What did Harlan have to say?" she asked. Gideon picked up a piece of the wood she'd split, turned it in his hands. Said there was a man in Caldwell Station 2 weeks back asking questions about the mountain claims up here, asking specifically about mine. He paused. Harlan described him, said he was a big man, well-dressed for that country, loud talker, the kind who expects people to answer him. She put the splitting maul down. The sound of the clearing came back to her. The drip of melt off the eaves, the horses shifting in the shelter, a bird somewhere in the high pines doing its first tentative spring business. All of it very present and very ordinary, and underneath it, that cold thing she'd been waiting for since January, since Gideon had said we'd handle it and she'd known he was right to plan for it. "That's Silas," she said. The words came out level. She was surprised by that. "That's what I thought," Gideon said. She looked at her hands on the maul handle. They weren't shaking. She noticed that specifically, took inventory of it. 5 months ago they would have been. "Did Harlan tell him anything?" "Harlan doesn't talk to strangers about other people's business," Gideon said. "It's one of the things I value about Harlan." He set the piece of wood down on the pile. "But Caldwell Station's not a big town. He'd only need to ask the right person once." She picked up the maul again, positioned another piece of wood on the block, swung it, and the wood split clean. "Then he'll come," she said. "Most likely." Soon. Gideon looked at the mountains above them, at the snow still thick in the upper country, at the road, if you could call it that came up through the southern pass. "Pass won't be clear for another few weeks at this elevation," he said. "Maybe 3. Maybe a little more." 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks, give or take, before the road that had kept them naturally separated from the rest of the world cleared enough for a man on horseback to make it up. She split another piece of wood, and another. She worked through the rest of the pile with a steadiness that had something fierce underneath it, and Gideon watched her for a moment and then went to help without being asked, and they finished the morning's work in silence that was not empty but full of the specific shared awareness of 2 people who have just had a conversation that changed the texture of the days ahead. That night she lay awake. She did not pretend otherwise to herself. She lay in the dark and listened to Gideon's steady breathing and thought about Silas Mercer with a clarity that was new. Not the old clarity of fear, which was really just a heightened attention to danger, a reading of every shift in sound for what it might precede. This was different. She was thinking about him the way she thought now about problems the mountain presented, practically, with respect for what was real, without flinching from it. He would come up that road. He would arrive at this cabin. He would stand at that door with the particular authority he wore like a coat, the authority of a man who had never in his life been told by anyone he couldn't have what he'd decided he wanted. She thought about who she had been when she left, the woman who'd sat on the kitchen floor in cold soup and made a plain cold calculation about her own survival. She thought about who she was now, after 5 months of learning to read weather and fire and a rifle and the slow, reliable character of a man who kept his word as simply as other men breathe. She was not the same person who had walked off that porch in the dark. She wasn't sure Silas would know that. She wasn't sure it would matter to him. But it mattered to her, and in the dark she held on to it the way she'd learned to hold on to practical things. Not for comfort, but because it was true and useful. She fell asleep somewhere after midnight, and her sleep was not gentle, but it was solid, and in the morning she got up before light and made coffee and stood at the window watching the first pale color come into the sky above the eastern ridge, and felt something settle in her chest like a stone finding the bottom. Whatever was coming, she was going to be standing up when it arrived. The weeks before Silas came were not wasted ones. She didn't plan it consciously, at least not entirely. But she found herself, in those 3 weeks, paying attention to the cabin and the land around it in a different way. Not with fear exactly, but with the specific attention of someone who understands that knowing your ground matters. She walked the clearing's edges. She knew where the sight lines were, which directions gave advantage, where the natural cover sat. She wasn't building a battle plan. She was simply knowing the place she lived. She also practiced with the rifle more than she had been. Gideon noticed and didn't comment on it. He refilled the ammunition box without being asked, and one afternoon came out and stood behind her while she worked on her distance shots, the targets he'd set at the far tree line, and when she put 4 out of 5 inside a handspan grouping, he said, "You've gotten steady." And the way he said it was its own kind of weight. "I had good reason to," she said. "Most people do," he said. "Most people don't use it." She looked at him then, and he was looking at the target, not at her, but she understood what he was telling her. That capability without circumstance was just potential, and that she'd had the rarer thing, which was actual cause to develop it all the way through. They talked about Silas once more, practically, in the way they'd begun to handle most of the serious things between them. Not with prolonged deliberation, but with the focused brevity of people who both know what's real and don't need it dressed up. "He'll try to make it about law," Gideon said one evening. "Men like that always do. He'll have an argument." "He'll say I owe him something," she said. "He always does. He'll say I owe him for raising me, for the roof, for the food. He keeps a running account in his head of everything that's ever passed in my direction, and he considers it a debt I can't fully repay." "And what do you owe him?" She looked at the fire for a moment. "Nothing," she said. "I know that now. I didn't always know it that cleanly, but I know it now." He nodded, like she'd confirmed something he'd already worked out. "Then that's what matters," he said. "When he comes, you know what you know." She looked at him across the table. "What are you going to do?" "Whatever you need me to do," he said. "No more." She absorbed that. It was such an unusual offer that she sat with it a moment before she trusted herself to respond to it properly. Not "I'll handle it," which would have meant she was a thing to be handled along with it. Not "don't worry," which would have been dismissive. Whatever you need me to do, her call, her ground. "I need you to be there," she said, "right there beside me, not in front." "All right," he said. "He needs to see that I chose this," she said, and her voice was steady, but there was something in it that was working hard to stay that way. "He needs to see that I'm not here because I was placed here, or because I had no options, or because someone moved me like a piece on a board. He needs to understand that I'm here because I decided." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He may not be willing to understand it," he said carefully. "I know," she said, "but I need to say it anyway. Not for him. For me." Something moved in his face, that internal acknowledgement, the thing she'd learned to read as his most genuine form of response. He reached across the table and picked up the coffee cup he'd been nursing and drank from it, and when he set it down again, he said, "You'll say it then." "I will," she said. The fire said its steady peace. The mountain held its final weeks of winter outside. Silas Mercer came on a Thursday. She was near the woodpile when she heard the hoofbeats. The sound traveled far in that country when the air was right, carrying through the trees before the horse was anywhere near visible on the trail. She heard it and went completely still, listening the way the mountain had taught her to listen, reading the sound before reacting to it. One horse, moving at a pace that said the rider wasn't being careful about being heard. He was announcing himself. That was Silas. He didn't sneak. Sneaking was for people who weren't certain of their right to be somewhere. She put down the wood she'd been carrying and walked to the cabin door and looked inside. Gideon was at his workbench, and he'd gone still too. He'd heard it. Their eyes met. "One horse," she said. He nodded. He stood up from the bench and lifted his coat from the hook near the door, but did not take the rifle down. She noticed that. He was making a choice, present, not armed. She understood the calculation and agreed with it. This was not going to be resolved by the threat of force. It was going to be resolved by something that force couldn't touch, if anything could. She went to the hook where her own coat hung. She put it on. She took a breath, slow and deliberate, the way he'd taught her to breathe before a shot, all the way down, all the way out. And she stepped out onto the cabin porch. Gideon came out behind her and stood one step back and to her right. Not in front, beside, where she'd asked him to be. The hoofbeats were close now. The trail from the South Pass came through the trees and opened into the clearing maybe 60 yards from the cabin, and she watched that opening the way she'd learned to watch the far tree line, with attention, without flinching. Silas Mercer came through the trees at a canter and pulled his horse up hard when he saw her, the horse tossing its head at the abruptness of it. He sat there for a moment at the clearing's edge, and even at 60 yards she could see the shape of him, the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. Everything about him had always spoken the same language. "I am in charge. This is not a question." He rode across the clearing at a walk, taking his time now. He wanted her to watch him come. He'd always done that. Made you stand and wait for him, made you aware of the time it took him to get to you, as time you were being kept in place. She stood and let him come and did not shift her weight or fold her arms or drop her chin. He stopped his horse at the edge of the porch, looked down at her from the saddle the way he'd always looked at her, from above, in every sense. Then his eyes moved to Gideon. She watched him assess the height, the build, the stillness of the man standing just behind and to the right of her. Silas's jaw set in the specific way it set when he encountered a variable he hadn't planned for. "Evelyn," he said. "Silas," she said. He looked at Gideon again. "This the man you ran off to?" "This is my husband," she said. "Gideon Hale." Gideon said nothing. He stood exactly where he was, his hands easy at his sides, looking at Silas Mercer with an expression of absolute unhurried attention. He wasn't performing calm. He simply was it, the way a mountain is itself, not in opposition to the weather, just present and solid while the weather does what it does. Silas dismounted. He tied the horse to the porch rail with the casual proprietary motion of a man who considers other people's property his own to use as convenience requires. He stepped up onto the porch, which immediately made the porch feel smaller. He was a big man, broad through the chest, and he had spent 40 years understanding that his size was useful in a certain way, and he had practiced that usefulness until it was automatic. He stopped 3 feet from Evelyn. She did not step back. She had stepped back from him 10,000 times in 15 years. She had stepped back until she ran out of room and hit a wall, literally and otherwise. She had calibrated the distance between herself and his anger with the precision of a woman whose survival had depended on it. She knew every inch of the retreat. She did not take it. "You need to come home," he said, not asking, informing. "No," she said. He blinked. She had said no to Silas Mercer before. Of course she had, in small ways, in careful ways, testing the edges. But she had never said it this plainly. One word, no padding around it, no apology preceding it, no inflection designed to soften the impact. Just no. "This is not a discussion," he said, and his voice dropped into the register that had always preceded the part that hurt. "You're right," she said. "It isn't, because there's nothing to discuss. I'm not going anywhere with you." She felt Gideon behind her, not moving. He hadn't moved. But she felt him the way you feel a wall at your back when you're leaning into a wind, not pushing her forward, just there, solid. Silas's eyes moved to Gideon. His whole face shifted into the expression he used for men he was trying to establish dominance over, which was a performance of irritation and contempt mixed in a specific ratio that had worked for him in most situations. "This your idea?" he said to Gideon. "Sending for someone else's property?" Gideon looked at him for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, the same pitch he used to explain how the stovepipe damper worked. "Your sister is not property," he said. "And this was her idea from the start. I answered an inquiry. Everything that followed was her choice." "Her choice," Silas repeated, with a particular contempt. "She doesn't make choices. She makes mistakes, and I fix them." Evelyn felt something move in her. Not anger, or not only anger, something more structural than anger. Like the thing that had shifted in her on the kitchen floor in the cold soup was shifting again, only further this time, and with a finality she could feel in her bones. "You didn't fix anything," she said. "You broke things. For 15 years, Silas. You broke things, and then stood over the pieces and called it management." He turned his eyes back to her. She watched him recalibrate. He hadn't expected her to go here, hadn't expected the directness of it. The contempt in his face was mixing now with something else, something she'd only seen in him rarely, a flicker of uncertainty, quickly covered. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said. His voice had an edge in it now that she recognized, the edge that had always come before the hand. "The last time you said that to me, I was sitting on a kitchen floor covered in soup I'd knocked over when you hit me," she said. Her voice was steady. She was astonished that it was steady. "I thought about that a lot up here, about how I'd been afraid of making a fool of myself in front of a man who thought hitting his sister was a reasonable response to a burned pie crust. I've stopped worrying about your opinion of my choices." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard since the worst storms of winter. Silas's face went through something. She watched it happen. The contempt, the recalculation, the decision to change approaches. He turned to Gideon with the expression of a man bringing a complaint to an authority he grudgingly acknowledges. "You don't know what you've taken on," he said to Gideon. "She's difficult. She's been difficult since she was 12 years old. I gave her everything." "You gave her nowhere to go," Gideon said. The words were quiet but precise. "That's not the same thing." Silas stopped. He looked at Gideon with the flat assessment of a man who has just discovered that the obstacle in front of him is larger than it appeared. "This is my land," Gideon said, still quiet. "This is my wife's home. You came here uninvited. We've listened to what you had to say." Pause. "We've heard it, and the answer is no." Silas looked between them. He was doing the calculation she could see him doing. The size of Gideon, the set of his stance, the particular quality of stillness that had nothing performative in it, which was, in its own way, more serious than aggression. He was used to reading men. He was reading this one and finding something he hadn't brought the tools to dismantle. Then he made his mistake. He reached out and gripped Evelyn's arm, not striking, but gripping, the grip that meant "I will move you if you will not move." And she looked down at his hand on her arm and then looked up at him. She didn't call for Gideon. She didn't move away. She looked her brother directly in the face for the first time since she'd been 12 years old, without the specific protective flinch that had become as natural as breathing, and she said, with a clarity so complete that it surprised even her, "Take your hand off me." 3 words. No volume behind them. No drama. The same tone she'd used all winter when she needed something done, and it needed to be done correctly. His hand stayed where it was for one more second. She held his gaze through that second and did not blink and did not look away. Then Gideon moved. Not fast. He didn't lunge, didn't grab, didn't escalate. He simply stepped forward and put himself close. Close enough that Silas would have had to reach past him to maintain the grip. Close enough that the difference in their builds was immediately and unmistakably apparent. And he said, without any particular inflection, "She asked you to let go." Silas let go. The moment he did, something changed in the air of the porch. Something had been taken from him, not by force, but by a refusal that had no crack in it. And he was a man whose whole machinery ran on finding the crack. And he'd just run it against 2 people who had closed theirs. He stepped back. 1 step, then another. He looked at Evelyn, and there was something in his face that she'd never seen there before. Something that wasn't rage, wasn't contempt, wasn't the practiced authority she'd spent 15 years trying to navigate. It was smaller than those things. "You'll regret this," he said, the classic last word of a man who has run out of actual options and is trying to make the other person carry the weight of his loss. I regret a lot of things, she said. Leaving doesn't make the list. He stood there for one more moment, a long moment. The mountain was entirely quiet around them. No wind, no bird, just the sound of his horse shifting its weight, and the slow drip of snowmelt from the cabin eaves. Then he turned, untied his horse, mounted, and rode out of the clearing the way he'd come in. Back through the trees, back toward the South Pass, back toward the road that had taken her away from him and that he had apparently believed was a road she could be made to walk in reverse. She and Gideon stood on the porch and listened to the hoofbeats go. They went steadily, not fast, no retreat. He would never let himself look like a retreat. But they went, and they diminished, and they moved further into the trees, and then the trees absorbed the sound, and there was nothing. The clearing was quiet. The mountain was quiet. The snow dripped off the eaves in a steady rhythm. She stood there and breathed, in and out, 3 times. Her legs were shaking. She noticed it with something like detachment, the way you notice weather from inside. Her hands had balled into fists at some point, and she made herself open them, finger by finger. Gideon was still beside her, still not in front. She turned to look at him. He looked back, and his face was its usual composed, weathered self, except that around his eyes there was something careful, something that was asking, without words, how she was. She couldn't speak for a moment. She tried and found the words weren't ready, which surprised her because she'd felt so steady through the whole thing, steady in a way she wouldn't have believed possible 6 months ago. The steadiness had been real. She knew that. She hadn't performed it. But now that the cause of it had ridden away through the trees, something underneath the steadiness was coming undone, the way a muscle aches properly only after you stop using it. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Not to stop crying, she wasn't crying, or not yet, but to give herself somewhere to put the pressure of everything that was trying to leave her body at once. Gideon put his hand on her shoulder, just his hand, not pulling her in, not directing her anywhere, just the weight of it, present and warm through the wool of her coat. She took another breath. "He's gone," she said. "He's gone," Gideon said. She stood with his hand on her shoulder and the mountain quiet around her and let herself feel the size of what had just happened. Not the drama of it, not the story she'd tell someday when she could tell it, but the actual size of it, the 15 years of weight it represented, the 15 years of weight that had just been put down on a cabin porch in the Blackstone Mountains. She had looked at Silas Mercer and said no, and held his gaze through the second he'd needed to decide she meant it. She had done that. Not Gideon. He had been there, exactly where she'd asked him to be, and his presence had mattered in the way a wall matters when you need something solid behind you. But the words had been hers. The held gaze had been hers. The ground she'd stood on had been hers because she'd claimed it over 5 months of learning to stand on it. She lowered her hand from her mouth. "I need to sit down," she said. "That makes sense," he said. They went inside. She sat at the table and he put the kettle on without asking, and the cabin was warm and solid, and the door was shut, and the porch was empty, and the road that led away through the mountains was taking Silas Mercer somewhere she didn't live anymore. She put both her palms flat on the table, pressed them down, felt the grain of the wood under her hands, rough and real. "He'll tell people I was ungrateful," she said. "Probably," Gideon said from the stove. "He'll make a story of it that makes him the reasonable one. Most likely." "I don't care," she said, and understood as she said it that it was true. Not the defiant kind of not caring, not the kind that's really caring stated backwards. She genuinely didn't care what Silas Mercer told people in a town she'd left and didn't plan to return to. She cared about the table under her hands, and the fire in the stove, and the man who had stood where she'd asked him to stand without once trying to take the thing from her that needed to be hers. She cared about this mountain and what she'd made of herself on it. Gideon brought the coffee and sat down across from her. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her the way he always looked at things he was taking seriously, directly, without fuss. "You did that," he said. She looked back at him. "We did that." He shook his head very slightly. "You asked me to stand beside you. I stood beside you. What happened on that porch, that was you." He picked up his coffee. "Take it. It's yours." She sat with that for a moment. It was a strange feeling, being given the full credit for something. Not split, not diminished, not reframed, just given. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he said. They drank their coffee. Outside, somewhere high on the mountain, a bird was calling. The first real spring bird, one she'd been hearing for a week now and hadn't yet learned to name. She made a note to ask him what it was. The afternoon was still ahead of them. The clearing was empty and the road was clear, and the mountains stood around the cabin the way they always had, enormous and indifferent, and somehow, exactly because of that indifference, entirely on her side. The bird she'd been hearing all week turned out to be a mountain thrush. Gideon told her that evening when she asked. He said it without looking up from the harness he was oiling, just named it the way he named most things, plainly, as if the information had been sitting there waiting for her to want it. Mountain thrush. "Comes back the same week every year," he said. "You can set a calendar by it if you trust birds more than paper." She thought about that, about trusting birds more than paper, about what it meant to live in a place long enough that the return of a single bird became a reliable fact, something you counted on, something that told you where you were in the turning of a year. She was beginning to understand what that felt like. The days after Silas left had a particular quality she hadn't expected. She'd anticipated relief, and relief was part of it, the undeniable loosening of something she'd been holding braced against for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer than she could accurately measure. But alongside the relief was something else, something she had to sit with for several days before she could name it. Grief, maybe. Or something in the neighborhood of grief. Not for Silas. She was clear on that. She didn't miss him and wasn't going to pretend she did, not even in the private space of her own thoughts, where pretending serves no purpose. What she was grieving, she eventually understood, was the version of her life in which none of it had been necessary. The version where she'd had parents who lived, or a brother who was different, or a door out that appeared earlier, or any number of things that might have meant she didn't spend 15 years learning to be very small in order to stay safe. That version didn't exist. It had never existed. But there was a specific ache in understanding that fully, in putting it down, finally, completely, and standing in the life that was actual. She didn't talk about this with Gideon, not right away. She was still learning which things she could bring to him and how, still learning where his listening lived and what it could hold. She'd learned a great deal about that over winter, that he didn't require her to package difficult things neatly before she handed them over, that he could sit with something raw and not feel compelled to fix it immediately. But she also knew that some things needed to be felt all the way through before they were ready to be spoken aloud, and this was one of them. So she let the days pass, and she did the work that the days required, and somewhere in the doing of that work, she found that the grief moved through her at its own pace, the way weather moved through, present and real, and then gradually passed. Spring arrived properly in April. The snow pulled back from the upper meadow, and the creek that ran along the north edge of their land ran loud and cold and full with it, and the trees along the lower trail put out their first tentative growth, small and insistent. The particular green of new things that have waited all winter underground and are finished waiting. She planted a kitchen garden. She had been planning it since February, making notes on the back of a piece of paper she kept in her coat pocket, consulting Gideon on what would grow at this elevation and in what soil conditions and what the season length would allow. He knew the ground the way he knew most things, not from books but from years of direct experience, from having made mistakes and learned from them and tried again. He told her the south-facing slope beside the woodpile would hold heat the longest. He told her which crops weren't worth the effort up here and which ones surprised you. He said that last year he'd had runner beans that did better than anything he'd planted in 8 years, and he didn't fully understand why, which she appreciated him saying that he didn't fully understand why. She was developing a respect for the limits of certainty. She dug the plot herself. It took 3 days because the ground hadn't been worked before, and the roots of things that had established themselves over years didn't give up without argument. Her shoulders ached. Her hands blistered in the places where she hadn't yet built the calluses for this particular work. She kept at it. Gideon watched her work on the first morning, and then, the second morning, appeared beside her with a second tool and started working the adjacent section without asking or making anything of it. They dug in parallel, not talking much, just working, And by the end of the second afternoon, the plot was open and turned and smelling of the dark particular richness of mountain earth. You didn't have to help, she said. I know, he said. It was going to be my project. Still is, he said. I just dug some holes. She looked at him. He was wiping his hands on a rag, looking at the turned earth with the expression of a man assessing what's in front of him for practical purposes. You are a very specific kind of person, she said. He looked at her then. That a problem? No, she said. It's actually the opposite of a problem. He held her gaze for a moment, and in the space between them something sat that had been sitting there for a while, growing at its own pace, the way things grew in that country. Not performing, not rushing, just steadily becoming more of what they were. He looked back at the garden plot. Beans on the east end, he said. Root vegetables in the middle where I can add depth. Herbs close to the door where you can get to them without a journey. I know where I want things, she said. I know you do, he said, with the corner of mouth thing that was his version of a smile. I'm just talking to hear myself. She laughed. It surprised her. Not that she was laughing. She'd been laughing more in the past months than she had in years, but the ease of it, the way it came without preparation or permission. He looked at her when she laughed, and his expression did the thing it sometimes did. That opening, brief and quickly held, that she'd learned to recognize as the version of himself he didn't quite know what to do with yet. She picked up her tool and went back to work and let him have the moment without crowding it. What? May brought neighbors. She hadn't fully grasped through the isolation of winter that there were other people on the mountain. Not many. The Blackstone country was not hospitable to large settlements, but scattered along the various ridges and valleys were a handful of families and individuals who had, for their own reasons, decided that this was the life they wanted. The Aldrich family ran a small cattle operation 3 miles north, 2 parents and 4 children ranging in age from 7 to 16, practical, direct people who had been on the mountain for 11 years. A widow named Agnes Pruitt held a claim 2 ridges east, a woman in her 60s who had outlasted 2 harsh winters alone since her husband died and showed no signs of finding this remarkable. Harlan Briggs, who Gideon had mentioned in March, passed through periodically on his way between his trap lines, a man of few words who distributed those words with the care of someone who understood their value. They came, over the course of May, in 1s and 2s, as the weather made travel possible, and the custom of checking in on neighbors after a hard winter asserted itself. Each visit was brief and practical, in the way of people who don't have time to spare but understand the value of knowing your neighbors are alive and functional. Each one looked at Evelyn with the careful assessment of mountain people encountering a new element in their small, specific world. She passed the assessment. She knew she did, not because she performed well. She didn't perform. She'd lost most of her talent for that over the winter, which was probably the best thing the winter had done for her. But because she answered their questions directly and asked her own and didn't pretend to know things she didn't know. Agnes Pruitt, who looked at people with the unvarnished evaluation of someone who has no patience for pretense, stayed for coffee and talked with her for 2 hours and left saying, in a tone that was high praise from that quarter, "You'll do fine up here." The Aldrich wife, a compact, efficient woman named Martha, who gave the impression of having 3 thoughts going simultaneously at all times, brought seedlings she'd started indoors and walked the garden plot with Evelyn and gave her specific advice about elevation and early frosts that Evelyn wrote down in the back of the same piece of paper where she'd been keeping her garden notes. Martha Aldrich had the manner of someone who dispensed practical information as a form of affection, which Evelyn recognized and appreciated because it was the same currency Gideon dealt in. "He's a good man," Martha said on her way out, nodding toward Gideon, who was in conversation with her husband about a fence line near their shared boundary. "I know," Evelyn said. "He was alone up here a long time," Martha said. Not a criticism, not even quite an observation, more like something she was offering Evelyn to do with as she found useful. "I know that too," Evelyn said. Martha looked at her with the direct evaluation she turned on most things. "Good," she said, and climbed onto her horse and called to her husband. And they rode out with the ease of people who've made this journey enough times to do it without thinking. That evening, after the Aldriches had gone, Evelyn and Gideon sat on the cabin porch in the mild evening air, the first evening in months when sitting outside was possible without suffering for it, and she told him what Martha had said. He was quiet for a moment. She'd expected that. "Martha Aldrich has her opinions," he said. "She said you were a good man." "I heard what you said," she said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the far tree line, at the last light going out of the sky above it. The mountain thrush was calling somewhere in the pines. She'd learned its sound now, could pick it out from the other birds that had returned with spring, and something about that felt significant in a way she couldn't fully articulate. That she knew this sound now, that it had become part of the specific texture of her days. "Were you lonely?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out of the quiet between them the way things sometimes did, things that had been waiting for the right configuration of stillness. He took his time. She'd learned not to read the time he took as avoidance. He thought before he spoke because he'd decided at some point in his life that speaking without thinking was a way of wasting the one thing you had that nobody could take back. "There's a difference," he said slowly, "between being alone and being lonely." "I know that," she said. "I'm asking which one you were." Another pause. The thrush, the light fading. "Some of both," he said finally. "The alone was mostly fine. The lonely—" He stopped, seemed to decide something. "The lonely was mostly fine too, except for the times it wasn't." "The times it wasn't," she repeated. "Winter, mostly, long stretches, when the quiet stops being peaceful and starts being just empty." He was looking at his hands now, turned palm up on his knees. "I didn't think about it much. Thinking about it didn't help anything, so I didn't." She understood that. She had spent 15 years not thinking about things because thinking about them didn't help anything and might, in fact, make them worse. The difference was that she had used that skill to endure something bad, and he had used it to endure something neutral, and the difference between those two purposes mattered. "It's not empty anymore," she said. She wasn't sure, as she said it, if she meant it as comfort or just as fact. Maybe both. He looked at her. The last light caught the side of his face, all the weather and years in it. "No," he said. "It isn't." They sat until the dark came down properly and the first stars appeared over the eastern ridge, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the quiet was not empty. June arrived, and with it a problem. The creek that ran along the north edge of the property had been running high all spring from the snowmelt, higher than Gideon had seen it in 3 years. This was not in itself alarming. Mountain creeks ran high in spring. It was their nature. But the high water was working at the bank on the east side of the lower meadow in a way that, if left unaddressed, would take out the fence line there by midsummer and potentially compromise the small hay production that line protected. They spent a week on it, the two of them, working the bank. This meant hauling rock from the upper field, substantial rock, the kind that had weight and didn't move easily, and setting it along the bank edge in a way that would redirect the current's force without damming it, because damming it would create worse problems downstream. It was work that required both judgment and physical effort in more or less equal measure, and it was the hardest sustained labor she'd done since arriving. She didn't complain. There were days when her back hurt enough that she moved like a much older woman from the cabin to the work site and back, and she was honest with Gideon about that. She didn't perform toughness, because performing toughness at the expense of good information was how people got hurt, but she didn't look for a way out of the work either. It needed doing. Her hands were capable of it. She did it. On the fourth day, lifting a piece of rock that was at the edge of what she should have been lifting alone, she slipped on the wet bank and went down hard on one knee, the rock landing mostly beside her and partly on her ankle, not broken. She took a breath and moved it carefully, and understood it wasn't broken, but it hurt in a way that was going to cost her the next few days. Gideon was at her side before she'd fully processed what had happened, his hands on her arms, not pulling her up but steadying, giving her the support to get herself up at the pace that worked. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "Sit down first, be fine second," he said, and there was enough practical firmness in it that she sat. He crouched and looked at her ankle with the careful, efficient attention he brought to everything that needed diagnosing, pressed along the bone, watched her face for the specific response that would tell him what he needed to know. "Not broken," he said. "I know it's not broken. Sprained, maybe. Twisted at the least." He sat back on his heels and looked at her. "We stopped for today." "The bank? We'll be there tomorrow," he said. "The creek's not going to move it overnight. We stop, you rest it, we reassess in the morning." She started to argue and then stopped because the argument was ego and not logic, and she'd spent enough time around Gideon Hale to have absorbed his particular allergy to decisions made from ego rather than sense. "Fine," she said. He helped her back to the cabin with the matter-of-fact care of someone who doesn't make a production of assistance but also doesn't pretend it isn't needed. He looked at the ankle again in better light and wrapped it with a competence that told her this was not the first time he'd had to manage a field injury without access to anyone else's help. She sat with her foot elevated on a piece of wood he'd positioned for it and felt, underneath the throb of the ankle, something that was hard to name. Not quite embarrassment. She'd gotten largely past the reflexive embarrassment of needing things, which had been one of the stranger gifts of the winter, learning that needing help and being a capable person were not in fact opposites. Something more nuanced than embarrassment. "I should have asked you to help with that piece," she said. He was at the stove putting the kettle on. "Yes," he said. Not accusatory, just, "Yes, that's accurate." "I didn't want to slow you down." "You slowing down for 10 seconds would have slowed me down less than losing you for 3 days," he said. She looked at the ceiling. He had a way of being right that was entirely without performance, which made it both easier and harder to take. "I'll ask next time," she said. "All right," he said. She spent 2 days with the ankle elevated, doing the seated work she could manage, mending, shelling the early peas that had come in from the garden, working on a piece of harness that needed attention. Gideon continued the bank work and came in each evening with the report of how it stood, which she found she cared about more than she'd expected. Not because she needed to be involved in every decision, but because it was her land too now, her creek bank, her meadow. The hay that field would produce was hay her horses would eat through the next winter. The fence line was her fence line. That sense of possession, not ownership in the Silas sense, not holding something over others, but the specific belonging of a person to a place and a place to a person, had been building in her for months, and she hadn't quite had words for it until she was sitting with her ankle up, being unable to go do the work, and finding that she cared about how the work was going. This was home. Not abstractly. Specifically. This ground, this creek, this meadow, these mountains. On the 3rd day she was back on her feet, carefully, and by the end of the week they finished the bank together and stood looking at what they'd built. Not pretty, just rock and packed earth and the specific satisfaction of work that solved what it needed to solve. "That'll hold," Gideon said. "For how long?" "Few years, if the water doesn't come higher than this season." He looked at it. "We'll add to it next spring if we need to." Next spring. She noticed how easily he said it, how easily she received it. Next spring was a given. Next spring existed in their shared future as a simple fact, not a hope or a plan exactly, just a point on a continuing line. She looked at the bank and the repaired fence line beyond it, and the meadow in its early summer green. "I want to expand the hayfield," she said. He looked at her. "Not this year," she said. "Next. If we take in another 2 acres on the south side, we could support more animals. You've been trading furs, but fur prices are unpredictable year to year. If we had cattle, even a small herd, that's a significant undertaking," he said. "I know. I've been thinking about it since March." She looked at him. "I know it's your claim." "It's our claim," he said. He said it simply, the same way he said most things that mattered, without underlining it or presenting it for admiration, just saying it because it was accurate. She held that for a moment. "Then I want to talk about the cattle," she said. He looked back at the meadow. She could see him actually considering it, not humoring her, not waiting for the right moment to redirect, but turning the idea over with the same serious attention he gave to fence lines and creek banks and weather. "The Aldriches would know where to source a starter herd," he said after a moment. That's what I thought, she said. It'd mean a second shelter before winter. I know. That's summer work on top of everything else. I know that too, she said. Are you saying no? He looked at her. I'm saying it's a lot. Most things worth doing are. The corner of his mouth. You've gotten comfortable arguing with me, he said. I've gotten comfortable with a lot of things, she said. They walked back to the cabin in the long evening light, and she made notes on the cattle question that night in the back of her paper. And 2 days later, they rode together to the Aldrich place for the first time as a couple making a plan, not neighbors making a courtesy call. Martha Aldrich met them in the yard with the assessing look she turned on everything, and then, apparently satisfied with what she saw, said, "Come in then. I'll put coffee on." July found the cabin changed. Not structurally. The logs were the same, the door with its reliable fit, the stovepipe with its damper she could now adjust in the dark if she needed to. But the changed thing was less visible and more real than any of that. It lived in the arrangement of two people's daily lives, the way they'd learned to share a small space without friction, not because they agreed about everything, but because they'd developed the habit of honesty that made disagreement productive rather than damaging. She still had bad days, days when she woke up wrong, when something small went awry, and her response to it was disproportionate, when the old reflexes surfaced, the flinching from a sound that turned out to be nothing, the brief terrible moment of hyper-awareness when Gideon moved unexpectedly in her peripheral vision. She didn't pretend those days weren't happening. She'd learned that pretending was expensive, and the cost came due eventually. On one of those days, in the middle of July, when she'd been short with him twice before noon over things that didn't deserve it, she stopped in the middle of the afternoon and said, "I'm sorry. I'm having a bad day, and I'm taking it out in the wrong direction." He looked up from the tool he was sharpening. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." He set the tool down. "Something specific or just a bad day?" "I dreamed about my mother last night," she said. She hadn't planned to say that either. "She died when I was 11. I don't dream about her often, but when I do, I wake up feeling like I've lost her all over again, and then I spend half the day trying to find my footing." He didn't say he was sorry, which she'd braced for and didn't actually want. He didn't fill the space with anything shaped like comfort that was really just shaped like filling a silence. He looked at her, and what was in his face was just attention, real attention, the kind that doesn't need to fix. "What was she like?" he said. She blinked. Nobody had asked her that in years. Possibly nobody had asked her that since the year after her mother died, when the asking was new, and then the asking stopped because people move on and expect you to have moved on with them. "Practical," she said after a moment. Funny, when she allowed herself to be. She had an opinion about everything and delivered them like weather reports. Just, "Here's what I think, here is why, and you may take it or leave it." She paused. "I got that from her, the opinions. Silas got the size of our father and the temperament of nobody I've ever been able to identify." "You miss her," Gideon said. "Every day," she said. "Some days more than others." He nodded. He picked up the tool again, turned it in his hands, but didn't go back to sharpening it. "My father died 8 years ago," he said, "the week after I finished building this cabin. I've sometimes thought that was why I built it when I did, that I knew something was ending and I needed something to be beginning at the same time." She looked at him. He didn't talk about his father often. He didn't talk about most things often. When he did, she'd learned to listen without interrupting, because the things he said when he said them were the things he'd been sitting with long enough to know their shape. "Were you close?" she asked. "Not exactly," he said. He wasn't a man who knew how to be close to people, but he was honest, and he worked hard, and he didn't ask anything of me. He wasn't willing to do himself. A pause. "I respected him more than I understood him, mostly. At the end, I think I understood him some." "What did you understand?" He thought about it. "That the quiet wasn't indifference," he said. "It was just how he was built, how I'm built." He glanced at her briefly. "I think you know something about that." She thought about the years she'd spent learning to read the specific language of his silences, learning that absence of words was not absence of thought or feeling. "I do," she said. "My mother died when I was 4, he said. "I don't remember her, but my father kept one thing of hers, a small piece of pottery she'd made. He kept it on the shelf above the fireplace, and he dusted it himself every week, the way a man tends things he doesn't want to lose track of. He set the tool down again. I have it here somewhere, in the back of the shelf. She didn't look. She'd find it in her own time. But she carried that small piece of information, a man dusting a piece of pottery every week for decades, alone, keeping something alive by the simple act of not letting it gather dust. And she added it to the growing knowledge of who she had married. She had married a man she'd exchanged 2 letters with in the back of a stagecoach in the small hours of a Thursday morning. She had known nothing. She had made her decision on the evidence of 3 lines in a newspaper and a single sentence about cruelty in a letter written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Sitting in the cabin in July, 8 months later, she understood something she couldn't have known then. The decision had been the right one, not because Gideon Hale was a perfect man. He wasn't. He was a man with gaps in his ability to reach toward people, a man who had spent enough years alone that sharing a life required ongoing and imperfect practice, a man who occasionally retreated into himself in ways that left her on the outside looking at a closed door. It had been the right decision because he was an honest one. And honesty, it turned out, was the foundation that everything else could actually be built on. Everything else could be worked with. You could negotiate the gaps and the silences and the imperfections if the ground underneath them was solid. The ground was solid. She had known that, in some inarticulate way, from the letter. She hadn't been able to say why. She understood why now. She went back to the kitchen work she'd been doing when she'd stopped to apologize, and he went back to sharpening his tool. And the afternoon moved through the cabin in its ordinary way, and the bad day was still a bad day. But it was a bad day inside a life that was hers, and that made all the difference between enduring something and living through it. Outside, the garden she'd planted in April was producing with a seriousness that still surprised her, more than she'd expected from mountain soil in a short season, enough that she was already thinking about what she'd put up for winter, already making the mental inventory of jars and root cellar space. Martha Aldrich had been right about the beans. They were extraordinary. She didn't fully understand why, and she thought she wouldn't pretend she did. Some things, the mountain had taught her, you just accept with gratitude and try to repeat next year. The cattle arrived on a Wednesday in late August, 6 of them, a modest starter herd that Thomas Aldrich had sourced from a ranch 2 valleys south. 3 cows, a young bull, and 2 heifers that were technically too young to breed yet, but would be ready by spring. Gideon and Thomas drove them up the mountain trail together, a half-day's work that turned into a full day, because one of the cows decided twice that she preferred the direction she'd come from and had to be persuaded otherwise. Evelyn heard them coming before she saw them, the particular sound of cattle moving through mountain timber, the complaints they make about terrain they find objectionable, the low, persistent effort of 2 men on horseback keeping them pointed the right direction. She had the new shelter ready. They'd spent 6 weeks building it through July and August, working evenings and spare daylight hours, adding it to the south side of the existing horse shelter with a shared wall that would help hold heat in winter. It wasn't beautiful. The roofline sat slightly uneven because they'd run into harder ground than expected on the 3rd post and made an adjustment that worked structurally but showed. She'd looked at that roofline more than once and thought about whether it bothered her. It didn't. It looked like something built by people who solved problems as they came and kept going. That seemed right. She stood at the fence and watched Gideon and Thomas work the cattle through the gate, and when the last one was through and the gate latched, Thomas Aldrich pushed his hat back and looked at the small herd milling in the new pen and said, "That's a start." "That's a start," Evelyn agreed. Thomas stayed for supper, though. Martha had sent food with him, a practical woman's acknowledgement that working men cover more miles than planned, and the 3 of them sat at the table while the evening came down over the mountains and talked about the fall work ahead, the hay that still needed cutting on the south meadow, the question of whether the creek bank would need reinforcement before winter, the small cattle herd, and what it would need through its first mountain season. She listened to Gideon and Thomas talk, and she participated when she had something to add. And she noticed the thing she'd been noticing all summer, that she was part of these conversations as a full participant, not as someone occupying a chair at the edge of a discussion being conducted by the people who actually mattered. Her opinions were addressed. Her questions were taken seriously. When she said she thought the hay cutting should happen before the weather shifted at the end of the week, rather than waiting until Monday, Both men looked at the sky through the window, and Thomas said she was probably right, and Gideon said they'd start tomorrow. Small things. But small things accumulated into the shape of a life, and she had learned to pay attention to them. Thomas left in the last of the light, riding easy down the trail he knew as well as his own yard, and she and Gideon cleaned up from supper in the companionable efficiency they'd developed over months of doing it together. She washed, he dried, and put away, and they'd long since stopped needing to discuss who did what, because the pattern had simply established itself the way patterns did between people who shared a space long enough, and honestly, enough. Thomas approves, she said. Thomas doesn't disapprove easily, Gideon said. Martha said the same thing about you, she said. He put a cup on the shelf. Martha Aldrich says things that could mean several different things and picks the interpretation she wants after she sees how you respond. Evelyn laughed. That is exactly what she does. She handed him the last plate. She told me last week that she thought this was going to be a good arrangement from the start. I asked her what made her think so, and she said, "You didn't look like a woman who was going to need looking after." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong," he said. "She said it like a compliment." "It was one," he said. He set the plate on the shelf and folded the drying cloth over the rack and turned to look at her, and his expression was the direct, unhurried one that meant he was going to say something he'd been considering for a while. "I want to say something, and I'd like you to just let me finish before you respond." She leaned against the counter. "All right. When I put that advertisement in the paper," he said, I want to be honest about what I was thinking. I was practical about it. I thought I needed someone who could manage this life, who wasn't afraid of the work, who wouldn't fall apart the first hard winter. I wasn't thinking about anything beyond that. I wasn't looking for... He stopped, found his way back. "What I mean is, I had practical reasons. That's where I started." "I know," she said. "So did I." "What I didn't account for," he said, "was that practical reasons can turn into something else. Without you deciding to make them something else, or working at it, or... It just changed. The thing that was practical became something I'd protect with everything I have." He was looking at her steadily, the way he looked at things he was serious about. "I don't know if I've been clear enough about that. I don't always know when I'm not saying enough." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on the table threw its warm light across the cabin, the same cabin she'd walked into 11 months ago, not knowing if she was making the best decision of her life or the worst, with her one small bag and her shaking hands and her face still carrying the last traces of a bruise. "You've been clear," she said. "Not always in words, but you've been clear." He nodded. She could see him wanting to say more and not quite finding it, and she didn't push. She knew by now that what he couldn't find in words in the moment sometimes arrived later, sideways, in the practical acts that were his most natural language. The wood stacked before she asked, the horse saddled on a morning she'd mentioned wanting to ride the upper trail, the ammunition box refilled without comment. She had learned to read that language. She'd gotten fluent in it. "I know what you're telling me," she said. "And I want you to know that I came up this mountain running away from something, but that's not why I'm still here." She held his eyes. "I'm still here because of what I found when I arrived. That's different. I need you to understand that it's different." He understood. She could see that he did. Something in his face settled. Not with relief exactly, but with the particular quiet of a thing that had been held carefully for a while being set down in the right place. "Good," he said. She pushed off the counter and went back to the bedroom and left him to whatever he did in the last part of the evening, the small, independent rituals of a person who'd been alone long enough to have developed them thoroughly, and she thought that she'd said the true thing, which was always the only thing worth saying. September came in clear and cold, the air sharpening at the edges the way it did when the mountain was beginning to think about winter again, not threatening yet, but reminding you it was coming and that you should be paying attention. She was paying attention. The hay came off the south meadow in 3 days of hard work. Evelyn and Gideon cutting and turning and hauling while the weather held. The Aldrich boys riding over to help on the second day in the way of mountain neighbors who understood that hay work was time critical and extra hands were worth more than anything else you could offer. She worked alongside the boys, 14 and 16, big for their ages and accustomed to labor, and kept pace with them, and she knew they noticed, and she didn't make anything of it, but she noticed them noticing. The hay was good, not exceptional. The summer had been dry in July, and the yield showed it, but good enough, and she'd already calculated it against the winter requirements of the horses, the mule, and the new cattle, and they were going to be close but sufficient if the winter didn't run longer than last year. She mentioned this to Gideon one evening, the calculation she'd been running. He listened to the numbers. "You've been keeping track," he said. "Someone has to." "I usually do it in my head," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see you doing it, but I like having it written down. I like being able to look at it." She paused. "Your head has served you well for 8 years. There's no reason we can't also have paper." He looked at her notes, looked at them seriously, going through the numbers. "You've accounted for harder weather than last year," he said. "I accounted for the worst year you told me about, which was 4 years ago," she said. "I'd rather have extra and not need it." "We won't have extra," he said. "Your numbers are tight." "I know they're tight. Are they wrong?" He looked at them again. "No," he said. "They're not wrong." "Then we know what we're working with," she said. He handed the paper back. "I want to trade for more feed in October," he said, "before the pass gets difficult, at a margin." "Agreed," she said. He went back to his work, and she went back to hers, and the evening moved through its ordinary course, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Two people running a life together as genuine partners, neither one making decisions and informing the other, both of them bringing what they had to the table and working with what was there. She hadn't known this was possible. She'd understood it as a concept, vaguely, the way you understand concepts that have no practical reference in your own experience. She knew it now in the specific lived way that made concepts real. It was not uncomplicated. They had disagreed in September about the placement of the second water trough for the cattle, a disagreement that lasted 2 days and involved both of them being more stubborn than strictly necessary before Gideon said flatly, "We could just try your way and move it if it doesn't work." And she said, "That's what I've been suggesting for 2 days." And he said, "I know," with an expression that was equal parts admission and irritation. And she'd had to work to not smile because smiling would not have helped. Her way worked. She didn't mention this. He moved the trough without comment. A week later, he told her, without context, while she was doing something entirely unrelated at the other side of the cabin, that she'd been right about the trough. She looked up at him. He was looking at the harness he was working on. "I know," she said. "Good," he said, and kept working. She kept doing what she'd been doing and thought, this man, this imperfect, quiet, obstinate, decent man. She had built a life with this man. October brought the fur trading trip to Caldwell Station, the first time Evelyn had been back to that town since she'd arrived 11 months ago as a woman who'd spent 2 days on a stage, hoping she wasn't making a fatal mistake. She sat on the wagon seat beside Gideon for the full day's ride down the mountain and watched the country change the way it had changed in reverse when she came up. The trees thinning, the road widening, the air losing its particular sharpness and taking on the more familiar quality of lower elevation country. The mountain behind them as they descended. She kept turning to look at it. "You're looking back a lot," Gideon said. "I'm making sure it's still there," she said. He gave her the sideways look that was his version of amusement. "It's been there a while." "I know, I still like seeing it." Caldwell Station looked exactly as it had. The same buildings, the same packed dirt street, the same general store and post office and tavern. The woman who'd brought them supper on the night they met was behind the tavern counter when they passed. And she recognized Evelyn with the particular look of someone updating a mental file. The fur trading took most of the morning, Gideon in negotiation with the buyer who came up from the south twice a year, and Evelyn went to the general store and made the supply purchases she'd been planning for weeks, checking items against the list she'd written out in careful order of priority. The store owner's wife, a talkative woman named Dorothy, who had strong opinions about everything and shared them freely, asked her where she'd come from originally, and when Evelyn told her, she said, "Long way to come." And Evelyn said, "Yes." And Dorothy looked at her in the specific way of a woman trying to read another woman's story from the outside and not quite getting the full text. Evelyn let her not get the full text. The full text belonged to her. She was loading the last of the supplies into the wagon when she heard her name. She turned. The man who'd spoken was the postal clerk, the same one who'd taken her letter all those months ago, a tidy, unremarkable man in his 40s with a careful manner. "Letter here for you," he said. "Arrived 3 weeks back. Wasn't sure when you'd be down." She took it. She looked at the handwriting on the front. She knew it. She stood beside the wagon for a moment holding the letter. Then she opened it. It was short. Silas's handwriting had always been aggressive, pressed hard into the paper, the letters large and forward-leaning, as if they were trying to get somewhere before the next ones arrived. "Evelyn, I have settled the claim on the house. You are not in it, so there is nothing there for you. I am writing to tell you that I will not be coming back up that mountain. I have said what I had to say, and you have made yourself clear, and that is the end of it as far as I am concerned. I do not understand the choices you have made, but I am done trying to unmake them. Don't write back. Silas." She read it twice. She folded it. She stood with it in her hand in the October sun on the street of Caldwell Station, and she took a slow breath. It was not an apology. She hadn't expected an apology, had in fact specifically not expected one, because Silas Mercer was not built for apology, had never in his life found the architecture for it, and a letter that pretended to be one would have been less honest than this. What this was, in the blunt and ungracious language that was all he had. A retreat made permanent. A door closed from his side. She had wanted more than this from him for a very long time. She understood, standing on the street, that she was not going to get more than this. The understanding had a specific quality of ache to it that she didn't try to deny or push past. He was her brother. He had been monstrous to her. Both of those things were true simultaneously and would remain true, and no ending was going to clean that up into something simple. But the door was closed. Gideon came around the side of the wagon and stopped when he saw her face. He looked at the letter in her hand without asking. "Silas," she said. He waited. "He's done," she said. "He says he won't come back." He looked at her carefully. "You believe him?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about Silas on the cabin porch, and the moment his hand had fallen from her arm, and the look on his face when he'd ridden away. Not rage, not plotting, but something smaller and less directed than either. A man who had run up against a refusal he didn't know how to process and had retreated to where the world still made sense to him. "Yes," she said, "I believe him. Not because he's turned into a better person, because coming back would mean admitting that coming the first time didn't work, and that's not something he could do." Gideon nodded slowly. He understood what she was describing. He'd met Silas Mercer exactly once, and he'd read him clearly enough. "How are you?" he said. She looked at the letter in her hand. She thought about what she'd wanted from him. Not recently, but over the years, all the iterations of wanting. Wanting him to stop. Wanting him to see her. Wanting, in the earliest years when she was young enough to still hope for it, for him to be the brother he wasn't built to be. "I'm not relieved the way I thought I'd be," she said honestly. "I thought when he was definitively gone, it would feel like more, like a bigger thing, but it mostly just feels like something that's over." "Maybe that's what over feels like," Gideon said. She considered that. He had a way of saying things that were simple enough to seem obvious after he said them, and were not obvious before. She thought it was probably the most consistently useful thing about him. "Maybe," she said. She folded the letter again and put it in her coat pocket. "I'm not going to write back." He said not to. "I know, and I'm not going to. Not because he told me not to, but because I don't have anything to say that would be worth the postage." She looked up at him. "Is that cold?" He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to questions that deserved it. "No," he said. "It's accurate." She almost laughed. Just almost. "Let's go home," she said. They drove back up the mountain with the supply wagon loaded for winter, the road rising under them, the air sharpening as they climbed. And she watched the mountain come back into full view above the tree line, and felt something she was willing to call peace. Not the absence of difficulty, not the pretense that everything was resolved, but the particular quiet of a person who is where they are supposed to be and knows it. The second winter arrived in November. She was ready for it in a way she hadn't been ready for the first, which made it different in almost every particular. The same storms, the same howling isolation, the same weeks-long shrinking of the world to four walls, and what was inside them. But she knew the stove and its moods. She knew the woodpile and what it represented. She knew the quality of the silence and what lived in it and what didn't. She'd been afraid, the year before, that the confined winter weeks would reveal something uncomfortable between her and Gideon, some incompatibility that the busy days of spring and summer and fall had successfully obscured. She'd been braced for friction that never fully arrived. What arrived instead was ordinary life, which was, she understood now, the thing she'd been missing all those years. Not drama, not rescue, not the resolution of all difficulty, but the plain sustaining fact of ordinary life. Coffee in the morning, work that needed doing. A man across the table who said what he meant and meant what he said and didn't require her to perform anything. She wrote letters in the evenings. Not to Silas. She'd meant what she'd said in Caldwell Station. She wrote to a woman she'd known before, a neighbor's daughter she'd been quietly friendly with in the years when friendship was something she had to ration carefully. She wrote to Dorothy at the general store in Caldwell Station, who had given her a small piece of paper with her name on it and said, "Write if you want. I like letters," with the uncomplicated directness of a woman who knew what she wanted and asked for it plainly. She discovered she liked writing letters. She liked the act of putting things into words precisely enough that someone who wasn't present could understand them. She hadn't had much occasion to do it before. There'd been no one to write to, or no one she trusted to write honestly. And the practice of it felt like the development of a muscle she'd always had but never used. Gideon read one of her letters once, by accident. She'd left it on the table, and said, when she came in and saw him reading it, "You write the way you talk," as if this were notable. "Is that a criticism?" she said. "No," he said. "Most people write like they're trying to be someone else. You write like yourself." She took the letter from him without comment and sat down and added 2 more lines to it. And across the table, Gideon went back to whatever he'd been doing before. And the fire kept its conversation with the stove. And the winter continued outside. And this was it. This was what she'd found at the end of a letter written on flour sack paper, with a pencil stub and her last coin. Not perfection. Not the end of hard times, because hard times were structural to this life. And she understood that now without romanticizing it or resenting it. Not a man without fault or silence or the occasional maddening certainty that his way of doing something was the right way until demonstrated otherwise. What she'd found was solid ground, the kind you could build on because you could trust it under your weight. In December, 2 days before the year turned, she found the piece of pottery. She'd been reorganizing the back shelf. Reorganizing the back shelf was one of those winter tasks that Gideon seemed not to have a strong opinion about, which was how she knew he didn't mind if she did it. And she moved a box of old tools, and behind it, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had been folded around it with care, was a small bowl. Clay, hand-shaped, not perfectly round, the glaze an uneven green-brown that might have been intentional or might have just been what happened. The size of both hands cupped together. She knew immediately what it was. He'd told her about it in July, the piece of pottery his father had dusted every week for decades, the one thing he'd kept of a woman he'd lost when Gideon was 4 years old. She held it carefully. It was imperfect in all the visible ways, lopsided, the glaze inconsistent, the rim not quite level. Someone had made it by hand, and that someone had not been a trained potter, but someone had kept it for 50 years, which was its own kind of craft. She rewrapped it and put it back exactly where she'd found it. That evening, she told Gideon she'd found it while reorganizing. She didn't apologize. She hadn't done anything that required apology. But she told him directly, because that was how they operated. He was quiet for a moment. "I should find a better place for it," he said. "Or leave it where it is," she said. "It's been in the same place for 8 years. It knows where it lives." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, that internal thing, the acknowledgement that went deeper than words. "My father was a hard man in most ways," he said, "but he kept that bowl on a shelf where he could see it, every day for 40 years. He paused. "I used to think that was a sad thing, a man with nothing but a bowl." "And now?" she said. He looked at his hands. Now I think it was the opposite of sad, he said slowly. I think it was a man who understood what he had and didn't let himself forget it. She held his gaze across the table. I think that's right, she said. He nodded once. He went back to his work. She went back to hers. Outside, the second winter of her life on the Blackstone Mountain moved through its dark and cold and certain course, and the cabin held against it the way it always had. Not beautiful, not effortless, built by one man's hands over one hard season, and added to by two people's labor in the time since, carrying in every wall and rafter the specific evidence of work done honestly toward a life worth having. She was 28 years old. She had come here running and stayed here choosing, and the difference between those two things was everything. She had learned to read weather and shoot straight and let herself be wrong and ask for help and stand her ground without shaking when it mattered and come back from bad days without pretending they hadn't happened. She had learned what ordinary life felt like when it wasn't threaded through with fear, and she was still learning it, would keep learning it, because the learning was the thing. It didn't stop, and the stopping was not the point. There was no clean ending to the story of a life. No moment where all accounts were settled and all lessons fully absorbed, and the future arranged itself into something manageable. Silas Mercer's letter sat in the pocket of her winter coat and didn't transform into anything other than what it was: a cold, graceless retreat from a man who would never be more than he was. The ache of her mother's absence would surface in dreams and in the particular light of certain mornings and in the moments when she most wanted to say, "Look what I built." The cattle would give them trouble through their first mountain winter, and one of the heifers would lose a calf in February, and she would sit with that loss honestly rather than talking herself past it. She and Gideon would argue again about something practical and something less practical, and probably, at least once, about something that was really about something else, the way arguments sometimes are. They would work it through in the plain, imperfect way they worked through everything, because the alternative was the kind of silence that has damage in it, and they had both had enough of damaging silence to know its taste. But the ground was solid. She had stood on it long enough to know. The fire in the stove made its small, reliable sound. The mountain held the cabin the way the mountain held everything on it. Not gently, not without cost, but with the absolute commitment of something that does not move. She reached over and moved the lamp a little closer to her writing, found her place on the page, and kept going.